Welcome on in to my Rapier Sword and Shield PvP build. I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with this build. It has excellent burst, excellent mobility, and does a great job locking people down with stuns and staggers, and does a good job especially killing things like healers, making it quite a good candidate for any kind of group fighting. But at the end of the day, this is a full melee light armor build, and it will struggle in an open field situation against a bunch of ranged opponents, especially if you're by yourself. However, on the flip side, if you're in terrain, this build is an absolute treat to play. So I think it is a solid build that is great in some areas and not so great in others. There is a bunch of gameplay footage at the end of the video if you guys want to see it, and of course a written guide on my website, pvpnewworld.com, a link down below for you. And without further ado, let's take a look at that build. Starting off with the attributes. 50 strength, 260 plus dexterity, 50 intel, and 150 constitution. I think because we're a light armor melee build, 150 con is quite useful. I mean, you could go less if you want to go more glass cannon, but you'll be really struggling if people pile up on you. If you're playing by yourself, I would recommend 150 con. You could even go more if you want to have a little bit more durability as well, because you could take a few points out of dexterity. But yeah, definitely want to have at least 150. Strength, the 50 points here are great for the sword and shield scaling, as well as 10% melee damage to our physical base attacks. That's really nice for Rapier as well. The intel is going to give the critical damage bonus on the 50 jump point, and of course some additional Rapier scaling. And then both weapons are getting a majority of their base weapon damage out of that dexterity, and all of the dexterity jump points are great for this build. Critical chance, thrust damage, 10 less stamina cost on dodge, bonus backstab damage, and of course bonus random critical hit damage. We've got a lot of stuns, slows on this build as well, so we can really take advantage of the 250 jump point here too. You always have the option of not putting 50 points in strength or intelligence, but I do like this setup more, and it's a lot easier to get the gear together for this kind of a setup than just a pure dexterity setup. So let's take a look at the weapons I'm running on this build, starting off with the Rapier. Penetrating backstab, vicious, keenly empowered. Officer's Ceremony is arguably one of the best damage rapiers for PvP in the game. I've got the electrified Gambit gem on here, 12% additional damage if stamina is not full, and that lightning dot whenever you hit an opponent. Very important to have that lightning dot, or just any dot in general on a Rapier, because they get a lot of stamina sustain out of those dots. So yeah, definitely the gem you want to have. And then for the sword, I've got Shadow's Edge. Rogue, Enchanted, and Keenly Empowered. Lots of damage coming out of this sword. This is a fantastic weapon. And on top of it, I've got that Gambit gem on here too. Ideally, I would like to add the dot to the sword Gambit as well, but I am playing on my Iron Man, and I didn't really have the resource to invest into this. The Gambit gem by itself, without doing the rune glass, is just fine though. And then for the shield, I have got Sturdy, Keenly Empowered, and Accelerated Resolve. Accelerated Resolve is crazy good. The movement speed bonus that it gives you is insanely useful, not to mention the fact that Resolve is just going to make you super bulky when you use it. The increase to your incoming healing is really nice as well. It definitely adds a nice defensive mechanic to Sword and Shield that it doesn't have access to if you're not using the Accelerated Resolve perk. On here I have Sturdy and Keenly Empowered. Keenly Empowered, unfortunately, doesn't fit well with the sword that I have here. Again, that's just kind of my gear limitations. I would prefer to have something like Keenly Jagged or even Vicious if I could here instead. Sturdy is an absolute must-have though. And then when I take a look at the actual armor that I'm wearing, I've got a good amount of Resilient and Elemental Aversion. I would highly recommend this for PvP at the moment. There's a lot of incoming ranged attacks, especially Fire Staff, and yeah, Elemental Aversion is going to help you deal with that damage a lot. On top of it, I've also got quite a few pieces of Freedom on here too. Freedom is really nice in PvP. I would recommend in light armor to have at least 3 pieces of Freedom so that you can break out of stuns a little bit sooner. I do have Physical Aversion on the feet here, which is a decent replacement if you don't have the Ellie Aversion. And then, of course, on the legs, I have Shirking Energy. This is really nice for the sustain of light armor. I know that they nerfed it quite a few patches ago, but I still really prefer to run it because you do get quite a bit of stamina back from it. The critical retribution on the helmet is not the most useful for this particular build. A lot of your critical hits are just going to be coming from backstabs anyway, so yeah, I would prefer to have another piece of freedom here if I could. And then for the gems on my armor, I've got kind of a weird mix of everything. When we look at the total resist that I have, 23% thrust resist, 10% to the other two physicals, and then 5% fire damage resistance. If I had 5 LE aversion, I think this would be a really nice setup for my resists. Since I'm missing 2, it's still good, but yeah, at the end of the day, I do think stacking thrust resist is the best way to go because a majority of incoming damage in PvP is actually thrust damage. And then when we take a look at the amulet, I've got the Champion's Amulet. Stamina Recovery and Health are the two that you absolutely want if you can only afford a purple amulet. Shrinking in Power, really nice for increasing your damage in PvP. You could also go for something like Divines here if you really wanted instead of the Shrinking in Power. I think this build could benefit from it quite a bit. And then for the ring, I've got the Heart of Aviva. Thrust damage, bloodletting, and leeching. Sword and shield, half of the attacks that you use are actually thrust damage, and then for rapier, everything almost is thrust damage, so definitely a preferred damage increase. You could use the champion's ring here instead if you wanted to. It's definitely up to the user on this one. Bloodletting doesn't do anything for me on this build. Again, kind of a gear limitation. Ideally, I would actually like thrust damage, hardy, and maybe even keen awareness, but I don't think that particular ring even exists in the game. So yeah. And then for the jewelry, I've got a Healthy Toast Refreshing Toast earring. This is definitely the earring you want. It is a purple one. I would like regenerating as the third perk if I did have access to it, but this is more than fine. These are the 2 absolute BIS perks that you need for PvP on that purple earring. I'm also running the Heart Rune of Cannon Blast. This is just because it's the only Heart Rune I have. I would actually prefer to run Stone Form on this build. I think because we have to put ourselves in such a dangerous spot in order to kill opponents as a light armor melee, Stone Form is a really good option to give you that get the hell out of there capability that honestly you just don't have. Stone Form is like a stun break if you get caught in a bunch of crap, so it comes in really handy. And then for the potions, of course, you want to run regular health potions, regens, mana potions, so you can get that healing from your earring here as well. And of course, you're going to need to run a food that gives you at least 40 of your maximum stats, and that'll help you just push better stats on this build. And last but not least, make sure you want to run that powerful honing stone as well. So let's take a look at the weapon masteries on this build. We're going to start off with the Rapier. This is a Rapier tree that I've been playing for a very long time. Definitely one of my favorite setups here. You could go for Riposte instead of the Flourish and Finish. Both are pretty good, but for the sake of this being a full melee build, I do like the additional reach that Flourish and Finish gives. Flesh, absolutely must have for Rapier. Gap Close, backstab damage. It can hit very hard too if you land the initial Flesh and the backstab on your opponent. And then Evade is kind of bread and butter of Rapier, so you definitely want to have this ability too, giving you all those cancels, the additional dodge, additional movement speed, stamina back, everything. Of course, momentum as the final passive for that additional damage, and then these last few passives here are focused on reducing cooldown, stamina sustain, and a little bit of outgoing damage. The big one here, of course, is controlled breathing. That's why I mentioned that you want the rune glass dot on your rapier, because each tick of that dot will give you 3 additional stamina back. So you can imagine if you hit 3 or 4 players with a flesh, you will be getting a lot of stamina back from this particular passive. And then some more cooldown reduction, a little bit of speed from swiftness as well. So let's take a look at these sword and shield skills now. Starting off with the abilities that I'm using. I tried a few different skills on this build, and these were the favorites that I landed on. Shield Bash, definitely one you want to have. This sets up the Rapier backstab, which can be followed up with a Flourish and Finish, Light Attack, Evade. We've got big combos coming off the end of this Shield Bash, so I definitely wanted to keep this skill. It's also kind of nice because you can use it defensively to stun the foe and then just break some distance between you and your target. The next one that we have here, Defender's Resolve. Thanks to the accelerated resolve perk that we have on the shield, this ability does so much for us defensively. Up to a 50% damage reduction, 30% additional movement speed, 13% additional healing power, and last but not least, you do get a bit of a burst heal at the end of Defender's Resolve, and you can end this early with something like a weapon swap as well. So very, very good skill that gives this build excellent mobility when it needs it. You can also pop this ability to enter the fight instead of just trying to escape a bad situation, and that will keep you nice and durable in the beginning of that engagement. And then for the last skill, of course, Leaping Strike, another gap closer paired with Flesh. We've got 2 gap closers on the build, giving us great mobility, great ability to get on top of opponents as well as get away from opponents. And Leaping Strike is nice because it will apply a cripple, and on top of it, it deals bonus damage if the opponent is lower on health. So let's take a look at the passives here. Sturdy Grip and High Grip, reducing the incoming stamina damage we receive from melee and ranged attacks. The block is very strong on Sword and Shield. It's the only block in the game outside of Greatsword with that one perk that can actually block ranged attacks. So yeah, I quite like reducing the cost as best that I can. I do try to use the block fairly often on this build as well. Another option if you don't want to put in the High Grip perk here, because ranged attacks in general don't do a ton of stamina damage, you could also go for Elemental Resistance, which will reduce the damage you take from those magical types. And this is really nice because there is so much Fire Staff in the game at the moment. Moving on to the other side, we've got a very offensive tree here. Final attack of your light attack chain will inflict slow. That's really nice because we get a damage bonus against slowed opponents thanks to Opportunist. Of course, Empowered Stab for that 30% damage when you land a heavy attack. This does include partially charged heavy attacks, which is a big part of playing Sword and Shield. It has a very fast partial charged heavy, which has pretty good distance on it too. So yeah, really good opening move for Sword and Shield is to go for those heavies. I've got 33% additional movement speed while blocking. Again, this was just kind of preference favoring the block setup. You could also go for Freeing Justice or even counterattack here if you wanted. We talked about Opportunist already for that additional slowed damage. Confidence for additional damage when you're at full health. This one, again, is a little bit of a flex spot. You could go for either the counterattack or the Freeing Justice instead. But the one you definitely want to have is Critical Precision for 20% haste for 5 seconds after you land a critical hit. Last but not least, Leadership for that 10% additional damage, not only for you, but also for group members when you have your Sword and Shield out. All right, let's jump into that PvP commentary. Starting off with the first clip here, we've got some OPR and hanging out in the enemy outpost, and a Hammer Blunderbuss player shows up. He's in light armor as well, and he starts just feeding those hammer heavies, and that's what I'm watching for, those incoming hammer stuns. He does hit me with the net shot, so I eat that snare, but right away jump on top of him with the Sword and Shield and get him with the stagger. And now another player has come in. We've got a Fire Mage, and this guy makes the critical error of gassing out his stam right away. And we have a super hard punish with the physical damage on this build. We just cut through him like butter. And the Hammer and Blunderbuss player, again, just kind of staying on the flag. He doesn't chase me outside here. I think that's a good call on his end because he has a ranged weapon where I don't. Now, the Grit from Flourish and Finish will prevent you from getting knocked down by that hammer attack there, so I'm able to absorb that incoming attack. But he just keeps throwing down some blunderbuss shots on me, and I get towards him with the Sword and Shield. I like to lead with the light attacks into the stun off of the Sword and Shield if I can. It just works better to actually land that stun. If you open with the stun, people will almost always dodge it because they expect the stun to be coming. The light attacks just kind of force them to roll a little bit, and then you can watch what they do and time your stun accordingly. And now these guys throw the healing circles down, and they're like, oh, you're not going to kill us because we've got our healing circle. That is not entirely true. We've got good burst, and we can push them out of the heal with the Flourish and Finish as well. The next player that ends up coming in, I get huge damage in as he walks around the corner, and even with the healing circle on the ground, I'm able to put the finishing blow in, and then I stay on top of this enemy healer. Big damage on him, just 2 light attacks taking out almost half of his health, and I try to jump on top with the Sword and Shield. The Hammer player waiting for me there, and he hits me with the counter stun, and I go up this staircase, but right away just pop the Resolve, and then turn around, drink a potion, and just keep working towards these guys. Again, leading with those light attacks into the hard stun, but I don't stick around to try to put damage into that guy. I try to jump on top of the enemy healer, but unfortunately, he does a good job rolling away. And again, I'm just going to use a little bit of movement, and these guys are just sitting on the flag. It looks like the Hammer Blunderbuss player just looking at chat or something there for a moment. The other player up top here, a second healer as well, he's throwing some heals down, and then I find myself getting sandwiched very quickly by a bunch of enemy players, but a whole bunch of friendlies come running in as well, and this just turns into a bit of a Zerg fest. Moving on to the next clip, a little bit of open world PvP. I think all the clips are open world PvP from here on out. And I was just doing a chest run. These guys were doing the chest run too, and I just kind of stood in front of them, gave them a couple pokes and said, hey, we're going to fight at the end of the run. Right away, a beautiful combo with the flesh to finish that first player off. And I don't down the body because it's just this last guy left. And if anything, he could be distracted by heading towards the body. This opportunity here to go for the flesh to finish off the downed opponent and, of course, get my flesh back. And a beautiful combo with the Rapier to finish off the second player. And these guys were pretty squishy, but definitely showing off how quickly we can kill a susceptible target. And on to the next fight. I am hanging out at the first light keep here, trying to get myself an engagement with these guys. This is a tricky fight because this is a very open situation, and like I mentioned earlier in the video, this build can really struggle as a light armor melee if you find yourself out in the open and you have multiple people shooting at you. So I try to go for a bit of damage on the first player there. I don't land the combo that I want, and I right away just retreat back up to the top. The idea here is that I don't want to be caught with my cooldowns off cooldown. And I do manage to get a really nice jump on the archer there, and there is a sniper up top on the third faction. He actually gets the finishing blow on that guy, and then I'm right away going to move on to the next ranged opponent. I want to kill these guys as fast as possible. I managed to bait out a beautiful stun, or move from him, which I counter with the stun, just holding block in front of someone to see what they will do. And yeah, really fast backstab to finish that guy off. And now it's just the hammer guy left here. And the guy up top also taking shots at him, but this build doing a great job just avoiding the incoming damage from him and kiting him out. And then he kind of goes into panic mode here, seeing himself getting a little bit too much pressure. And then just a nice stun to finish him off. Okay, moving on to the next clip. I wanted to show this 2v1 because it shows kind of one of the weaknesses of this build, and I think that's important if you guys want to see what the build is good and bad at. And this big weakness here is when you are fighting ranged opponents in a relatively open field position. Light armor melee can really struggle with this because you have to close that gap in order to hurt them. And if things go bad and you try to get away, they have ranged options to kill you as well. So as you can see there, the first pass didn't give me what I wanted, and I'm forced to retreat right away, wait for my cooldowns to come back, and see if I can re-engage with these guys. The approach is incredibly important here. I am going to try to use the shield to block a few of these arrows too, but at the end of the day, this is a very dangerous spot to walk into because I likely won't be able to get out alive even if I manage to pick up a kill here. But I do get in safely using the block and the roll. I'm able to avoid those arrows, and they pull out their melee weapons. I try to get the stagger there. It doesn't work. Go for the hard stun, and they both fall into it. One of the enemy players able to roll out in time, but the other guy eats that big cannon shot, and then I keep the pressure on top of him. I get good damage with my Rapier, but I eat a huge amount of damage from that guy's detonate as well. And this spear player plays well. He's sticking to me really hard. I had fought him a little bit earlier too. And there's a nice flesh after blocking the incoming flourish and finish from that player. And now this is the tricky part. I'm forced to turn around and try to be aggressive, and I whiff both of my counter stuns, and that's basically game over. I don't have the option to run away from the ranged player in that situation either, because he will shoot me with the bow. So I did want to include that clip so you guys could see where this build can struggle. Outpost rush, you'll have similar situations if you're out in the open as well. Now, for this last clip, a little bit of a 2v1. I hope you guys enjoy it as we say goodbye. If you want to check out some live gameplay from me, there's a link to my Twitch down below. If you guys want to see written guides to my builds, including this build, you can find it on my website, pvpnewworld.com. And if you have an awesome clip that you want to see in the New World Top 5 fights, feel free to send that to Kristofer at pvpnewworld.com. A quick thank you to our sponsor, ExpressVPN, for sponsoring the show. They can help keep you safe on the internet, and you can get a deal with your first purchase with them thanks to the link down below. And last but not least, a massive thank you to all of my patrons on Patreon for supporting the show. Thank you guys if you're supporting now. If you've ever supported in the past, it means a lot. And because of you, I've been able to keep the show going, so thank you so much. And thank you guys for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this build. It was very fun to play, very interesting, but again, I'm already moving on to something else. So yeah, look forward to that in the future. Have a great night, everybody, and I'll see you next time.